Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Daryll Scott. Good morning to you, Daryll.
Good morning.
Good to see you. You are a behavioural change expert with 30 years of experience as an entrepreneurial business leader and 20 years experience as a coach and a consultant. And today we are going to be exploring how to create high performance through performance conversations. And people have many conversations like this with their team, with their line manager, and we're going to help people create a real positive way of doing that. But before we get into that conversation, Daryll, I'd like to ask you, what do you love about what you do?
I love what do I love about what I do? The vibe, the change. So I love the moments when you're able to observe someone go from stuck or having difficulty, feeling conflicted, or in some way blocked to unblocked. So whether it's an epiphany they have, whether it's an ability they suddenly unlock, whether it's some kind of internal conflict that they resolve. But that moment when someone goes from frowning to laughing, that's the juice. That's the fuel for what I do.
That's what gets you out of bed in the morning, is it? I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think I'm a people pleaser, like lots of coaches are, and I enjoy the interpersonal experience of working with people and seeing them light up. Because you feel that too. It's very rewarding.
Yeah, and that's incredibly rewarding. I have the same view on that as well. So we're talking about performance conversations and how to get the best out of people, how to create that sort of high performance. From your experience and from your perspective, what are the sort of key elements of an effective performance conversation?
I think the easiest way to answer that question is to start by thinking about, well, what makes them ineffective? What gets in the way? What are the blockers? And typically, it's because the recipient of the performance conversation, the person who it's about, if you like, is not in the right place. They're defensive, or they're in a fixed mindset, or they have some kind of a current relationship challenge with the person who's trying to have a performance conversation with them. Maybe there's some underlying things that need to be addressed. But either way, it tends to be an interpersonal dynamic. I often ask people to consider the difference between challenging feedback from someone you trust and great feedback from someone you distrust. Because when you think about it in those terms, the quality of the relationship is really, really important. And also my mindset as the person receiving feedback, do I want it? Am I in a growth mindset? Am I seeing this as helpful and part of my development? Or am I seeing it as criticism? Interestingly, the book I wrote on it, which was I wrote with a business partner about 15 years ago, and we called it Feedback or Criticism, because it's that sort of underlying perception of, am I being defensive? Am I trying to be right, or trying to be correct, or trying to just get a pat on the back, or am I really in a mindset of gathering feedback and working out what I need to do to be even better tomorrow?
Yes, interesting, is it? Because it can be quite a transactional process, can't it? A lot of organizations go through this yearly through their sort of personal development sort of programs and sort of annual reviews, appraisals, what do you want to call them? And it becomes like a task, and it becomes very transactional. And it's interesting you talked about the interpersonal piece here, because that's really fundamental, and that's based on relationships, based on trust. It's based on understanding, empathy, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah. And the transactional thing does get in the way, but there's always that question of, is it a necessary crutch to make conversations happen in some contexts? So for example, years ago, sorry, that was my email pinging. Years ago, I worked for HBOS. They kind of disappeared in around 2008, but prior to that, and I ran a big program on this very topic at HBOS, and we had a C-suite conversation. And one of the people in the C-suite said, we were talking about how the process gets in the way of the authentic conversation. We're talking about how, a tick box exercise or something that you haven't really had a chance to think about, and you're filling out a form, and kind of detracts from the intention of the whole process. And one of the people in the C-suite said, well, do you know what happened? A few years ago, we realized that the process was limiting the quality of the interpersonal conversation. So we just got rid of it. We said, there is no process. You just have to have a conversation. And I thought, wow, how enlightened. And I said, what happened? And they said, nobody talked about performance. So without the process in place, people just avoided the conversation altogether, or certainly didn't make time for it. So I think it's an interesting thing where we need some discipline in some organizational contexts. There are exceptions to this. If you're working in a connected team that's constantly, like creative teams, for example, feedback is thick and fast, and it's daily, and it's about the project and the work, and rather than about you as an individual. Which is a topic I'll get onto in a minute if I have a chance.
And is that, just talk about that ongoing feedback, is performance conversations, are once a year, once a quarter, or should they be an ongoing dialogue? What's your view on that?
Yeah, ideally they should be just a daily way of interacting. They in a real high performance culture with huge high trust, when everyone's just trying to improve, feedback is asked for, it's canvassed. So there isn't any need to make it a process or put discipline around it. I mean, certainly you may still need to do the weights and measures thing for evaluation and pay and rations and whatever else, but the actual aspect of performing in your role and getting better at what you're doing, ideally in a well-balanced or integrated team, that should just be everyday conversation.
But how do we create that? It's a cultural thing then, isn't it? How do we create that culture where we're having the ongoing performance conversations, or conversations, whether it's, because any conversation really should help people grow, develop, inspire, all those things, really, shouldn't it? In terms of you're a leader having conversations, it's not there just to tell people what to do, it's actually to interact, build relationship, build trust. How do we create that sort of culture like that it becomes more of a everyday, just flows naturally?
Yes. Well, I'd answer that two ways. Firstly, I think those cultures emerge when people are entirely about what they're achieving and not about themselves. I worked for Apple years ago, and there's a really strong culture there of it's about the customer's experience and it's about the product, and it's not about internal politics or status or job titles, or so there's a really interesting sort of shift to what it is that we're there to do. There's that damn pink thing, isn't there, about pay people enough to take pay off the table as a concern, and then people focus on their intrinsic motives and perform better. And I think it's the same with this sort of stuff. If we all start with a grade A and our job is just keeping that, we do much better. But the closest I've seen to a way of handling it that becomes cultural is the Marshall Goldsmith approach, which is he wrote the New York Times bestseller, "What Got You Here Won't Get You There." Sort of highlighting that as we move up through our career, we cling to the things that we're very competent at, but we get to a level where what got us to where we are isn't really important anymore, and we need a new set of skills or abilities, or the game changes, but we cling to our competence as a sort of security blanket. And anyway, he has a process that he calls feed forward, which is where, rather than sort of the person in charge, if you like, the manager, Alfie, sorry, it's my dog, rather than the manager delivering feedback to someone, whether they want it or not, is much more the person receiving the feedback goes and asks for it. So you would come, for example, if it were us, you would come to me and say, I've got this thing that I'm having a challenge with. What would you suggest? How can you help me? And then I would, as the line manager or the peer or whoever you're canvassing that feedback from, I would make positive, future-focused suggestions. Positive being something to do rather than something to not do, and future-focused being very much about tomorrow rather than about a retrospective autopsy of yesterday. So I would make future-focused suggestions in a very sort of take it or leave it way. And the idea would be I'd make multiple suggestions and almost as thinking fodder, and you could pick the bones out of that and and decide what to do. But it sort of flips everything, because you flip two dynamics. Number one, feedback becomes something that someone asks for rather than something they're given. And number two, the conversation is all about tomorrow, not yesterday. And those two shifts really overcome the sort of defensiveness and the weird interpersonal dynamics that can sometimes exist when one person is kind of bestowing feedback on another. So that's the nearest I've seen to a methodology that can become cultural, because you can, once people understand that method of interaction, you can force it. You can create, windows of time where that's what we do, and we kind of almost speed network and get feedback from each other. So yeah, the book is What Got You Here Won't Get You There. Recommend it. It's a corker. That's the closest I've seen to a simple way of making it cultural. But fundamentally, it is about being in a context where your performance and the output and working together as a team is your prime concern, not your not being concerned about how you're perceived or how you're being judged, or all those other sort of interpersonal drama elements.
I like the idea of that approach where you ask for feedback, because that puts you in control, doesn't it? It puts you in the sense of in the driving seats. It means when you're approaching that person, whether a manager or a peer, you're open to receiving because you're asking for it. Basically, you're not being told it, and you're far more receptive. And I like the idea, the fact that you are putting in a few ideas. You don't have to take that feedback. You can just do what you like with it. And it's all future focus, and rather than saying you should have done this, you should have done that, which is always quite unhelpful, really. It's good to have learnings from things, but not to should have done things. And I think that's really helpful. So what other ways, because for me with performance conversation, you start at the start, it's that where a leader has a perspective, and hopefully they're positive about the whole process, if there's a formal process or not, doesn't matter. And then it's the recipient, in the right frame of mind, everything. There's two entities involved. And so just going to the leader, and let's say we have more of a formal process going on, and people might be listening right now who have got them coming up towards the end of the year. I don't know, on their sort of fiscal years. How can a leader prepare from a mindset point of view, but also from a more practical point of view before they have a conversation with the direct report?
Brilliant question. Okay, so yeah, focusing on expectations and perceptions. So obviously as a coach, you'll be familiar with the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy. But for anyone listening who doesn't hasn't familiar with it, it's the idea that our expectations change our behavior, and our behavior changes the outcomes. And then we go, I told you so. So it's almost, if I'm walking into a performance conversation and I'm thinking, oh, they might not like this, or this could be tricky, that will corrupt my behavior, which they will then pick up on, and it will change their behavior. And then if they're awkward or difficult or defensive or worried, then I'll say, I knew it'd be difficult. So our expectations create these sort of, this Pygmalion effect, it's called, or Rosenthal effect of your expectations come true because you make them come true through your behavior. So the thing to focus on there is, in terms of setting things up, is expectations. So what are your expectations going into it? Are they actually realistic, or are you expecting things that are you overly concerned? But also, how do you manage the expectations of the other person? So for example, if you're giving feedback to me and you suddenly just start the conversation, right now I've got some feedback for you. I go on to red alert. I think, where's this going? I've got no frame of reference. I can't really hear what you're saying because I've got this white noise of being concerned about what you're going to say. And you end up in that situation that I think we've all had at some point, where you sort of slowly become uncomfortably aware that what you're saying isn't what the other person's hearing. And it's because there's a misalignment of expectation. They think it's going to be a bad thing when it's actually not a bad thing at all, or they think it's not a bad thing when actually it's something they really need to pay attention to. Or you see that kind of mismatch of what's the conversation going to be like? What's the intention for it? Where do we hope we're going to get to by the end of it? And managing those kind of that frame of reference or those unconscious perceptions, creating that relevancy, creating those expectations makes all the difference. I remember The West Wing, that television show about the American president, and it got all the way to the 5th season or 7th season, or I don't know, whatever it was, the last one. And it was all about the new president coming in. And Bartlett, who was this president that had been through it all the way through, he was getting ready to leave office, and there was a moment where he brought in the 2 candidates, for the next who would be the next president, because he didn't know who was going to win the election, and there was a security problem, an international security problem happening that they needed to be aware of. They needed to take their first day in office, they needed to know about this international situation that was going on. So he brings them into the Oval Office before taking them into in to meet all the chiefs and the military stuff. And he says, I need to have a conversation with you about the conversation we're going to have. And it is a really interesting way of thinking. It's this meta point where you say, okay, we're going to have a conversation, but before we have this conversation, let's have a chat about what this conversation is going to be like and what we're going to get out of it. Let's get on the same page first, rather than just starting the conversation and hoping that somewhere along the way they'll understand what you're talking about. So it's with those kind of situations where it could be prickly, it could be misunderstood, it could be difficult, people could be emotive about the content of the conversation. The more time you spend managing their expectations for what the conversation is going to be like, and being frank about that, but making sure they realize that you're on their side. Even if it's a tough message, you can still be on their side. So, the more you set that up in advance, the more you can manage unconscious expectations, the better the conversation will go.
And I guess when we're talking about more of a formal sort of performance conversation, it's I guess framing the purpose around this and making sure that there's the reason for this is because of this. I want to create development opportunities for you. I want to ensure that you're getting the right feedback that will make you grow, etc., etc. And I guess that's almost the conversation about the conversation, isn't it? It's the scene setting, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, and get any elephants in the room out there early and deal with. I mean, there are situations where people, nod along, ignoring everything you're saying until you get to the rating and the bonus. So, can you bring that forward? Can you get that stuff that's a distraction dealt with as quickly as possible, and then go into the developmental feedback? Rather than attempting to give someone a load of helpful developmental feedback and then giving them the information that they've been sitting there waiting for the whole time, because that's obviously a distraction.
Because often, as you say, there's a 2 parts, isn't it? There's the performance bit of review of the year. Have you got performed against your objective? And here's some money bonus that links to that, which is obviously what people are interested in. And then, which for me is the smaller part, and that can be quite transactional in some ways, but the biggest part is to drive performance is the development piece, isn't it? That's what we want to really get into under the bonnet of, and really dig a little bit and start to have that. And also, I think just from my perspective, is making sure that this is it's a 2-way conversation. We're co-creating here, isn't it? We're not sort of, and I think that's the other flip, I think, from a leader, is not to sort of make sure it's not just a one way, this is how I'm going to do it, or so what I think you should be doing. It's a 2-way thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's discovery in that. So, one of the things that will scupper people is if they take feedback as fact, or performance related data as fact. And so I've got this information about you, I'm now going to tell you and impose it on you. And of course, it's not particularly valuable until we understand how we're behaving and what we're doing that's leading to those outcomes or those perceptions. So, if it's something about how you're being perceived or your interpersonal impact, well, that's someone's opinion, really. So it doesn't become helpful to you until you can work out, well, what are the specific things that are happening that's leading to that outcome? And similarly, if you're not performing in something that's more of a KPI, something that's more measured, well, great. That's there's an outcome. Win, lose, pass, fail, right, wrong. But none of that becomes interesting or valuable until you work out, okay, so what am I doing that's leading to those results? Yeah, good or bad. How do we unpick that and work out, well, what are the specific behaviors? What are the specific actions? How am I prioritizing my time? What am I focusing on? Where do I need development? That's when it becomes really interesting. Rather than, I remember a paradoxical conversation in a workshop once with a line manager where I said, okay, so you're going to give this person some feedback. What's your intention? What's the intention in this process? Why do you want to give them feedback? And they said, well, so that they know. And I said, great, okay, so they know. So what's the intention in them knowing? What's this all about? And he said, well, so that I've told them. I said, great, okay, so you've told them. So what's the intention in you telling them? So that they know. And we went round in a circle, and he couldn't break out of the idea that this whole thing was about him telling them things. and the idea of why are we even having this conversation? What's the intent? What does the organization want to get from it? What does the individual want to get from it? What's the upside here? It was completely obscured from him. It was transactional. I need to tell them because then I've done my job, and they need to listen. So yeah, there's sometimes a bit of a reframe in terms of what's it all about, really.
I think intentions is really important, isn't it? What's the point of all this? Why am I doing this? I think almost rediscovering yourself each time you have these conversations or formal processes. Each leader should think, what is the why behind what I'm doing here? What is the point? Otherwise, there's no point behind it. Then let's not bother.
Yes. I was reminded of that Tom Cruise scene in Jerry Maguire where he's going, help me help you. But it's, ultimately, whenever we help someone, we sit down to talk to someone about performance. Ideally, we're in most cases, we're trying to help. And that simple truth gets obscured through processes and formality and professionalism a lot of the time.
And also lack of time as well. I think that's another thing. People want to rush through, just tick the box, get on with it, and they don't. I think often leaders will walk into a meeting not even prepared for these and just run through the process. I've been in meetings where my line manager is literally almost reading it as he goes, as he's not really thought about it before. What else as a leader can you do to help get the recipient of the feedback and the conversation in a good place that will also receive it and work with it and be beneficial for them?
I think finding out what's important to them, because we're all intrinsically motivated in different ways. We come to work, some of us want to make a difference and make an impact or change. I say, I used to want to change the world. Now I just want to leave the room with a little bit of dignity still intact, usually. But we have these different motives. Some people want to master their role and be brilliant at it. Some people want to make a difference. Some people want to do something purposeful. Some people want to get recognition. It's really important to them. Some people just want to be in a great team and they want trust and transparency and honesty and a sense of connection and being in it together. Some people are really driven by their development, sometimes in a very individual way, in a very self-focused way. So we have all these different fundamental drivers, and knowing those drivers is really helpful. So just asking someone, look, what is important to you about your career is the most extraordinarily helpful question for being able to then talk about performance. Because otherwise we make the mistake of assuming that people are motivated by the same reasons that we are. It's almost like when you're in those organizations where the leader who's very, very concerned with numbers and metrics just spends all their time talking about numbers and metrics, and you can see all the blood draining from everyone's face. You could not give less of a whatever. So understanding what is motivational to that other person, tremendously helpful, in terms of finding the leverage to motivate them, or in terms of finding out how to help them with challenges. What of their particular motivation and style can help them overcome difficulties. So again, we're moving the leader to asking, not telling. to asking what's important, asking how they think they got into a pickle with something, or asking how they did something really well and how they can therefore replicate it. But being in that sort of investigative mindset of trying to work out what's really going on, rather than just try to deliver the message. And back to your point about preparation, because in larger organizations, this is really, my friends who are line managers of lots of people, I see them on the train, wading through these sort of PDRs, trying to update the forms to be ready for a conversation with someone they've only met once. And it is it's tricky to find the time to prepare. But without the preparation, then obviously it's you're not quite so well equipped. But the other way of thinking about that is, feedback shouldn't be about having built a really good case for the prosecution. It should be about the investigative part. And the more comfortable you get having more of a coaching style or more of a curious style in performance conversations, the more you recognise that, yes, preparation is essential, but it's not a one-way street conversation. So how much preparation do you really need? And if you're able to navigate the conversation well, then not very much. You think about us as coaches and the results we're able to get with people where we walk in, with very little prep in a lot of cases, and we work on what's coming up for that person circumstantially or currently. Because ultimately, whatever's going on for that person, addressing that is going to be the thing that unlocks their performance more than anything else, rather than something you've prescriptively prepared in advance that relates to something that happened 2 months ago. So, yeah, prep's important, time and space is important, but also honesty. I remember working with a leader who said, I've got to do 4 performance reviews of people I've never met. And I said, well, don't do them then. To do them or defer it. And they said, can I do that? And I thought, for heaven's sake, you're on the C-suite. But yeah, it's there's I think sometimes, like all very professional process, professionalism is great, and it stops us from sometimes realizing what the point of something is or what we're really trying to achieve, or it quashes our human abilities in the intention. And mainly the reason for being very, very professional about stuff is not screwing up, rather than being brilliant. Professionalism is not a supercharger of anything. It's a removal of fear and error.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you're a leader that's listening right now and they've taken some really good advice, hopefully from what you've said there, Daryll, some really good insights there, and they're going to have their performance review now with their boss, how as a recipient of feedback of those conversations can you prepare yourself and create a frame of mind that will be beneficial again for that conversation?
Yeah. Well, I guess it's back to intentions again and questioning what's a win. I remember I used to work in a consultancy, and one of the guys who reminded me of this story just a week ago, but he was an ex-FD, and he'd come into this consultancy, and we were all selling effectively. We were having to generate our own sort of business, and I came in and he was in the office and he was all dejected. And I said, what's wrong? And he said, well, I've phoned 10 people and no one's bought anything. And I said to him, well, have you had a good conversation with them? And he said, yes. And I said, would they welcome your phone call in the future? And he said, yes. And I said, did you learn something about them? And he said, yes. And I said, well, that's a roaring success. That the fact that it didn't end in a transaction, it doesn't really matter. Because it's a long game, and I think sometimes we could be a bit binary about stuff. So if you're going into your performance conversation, how can you frame it in your mind about, well, obviously there's going to be short-term things to address, and you need to know what you need to know about pay and rations and performance, but what are you curious about in terms of your own growth and development? What can you learn? How can you investigate more? How can you create How can you make it clear to the person who's giving you feedback that you're not being defensive and you really want to know more? Because the more you dig and the more you investigate and the more relaxed you can be chatting around it, the easier performance improvement becomes, because it's really, really simple. If we can get to the simplicity of it, if we're able to have that conversation without any fear or defensiveness or prickliness or overly professional guardedness.
Absolutely. I think that's really helpful. I think the whole conversation has been really helpful, Daryll. Made people think a little bit differently about things, and hopefully we're having better performance reviews for themselves, but also for their team that they sort of manage as well. If people want to connect with you, get in touch with you, what's the best way of doing
that? My website is daryllscott.com. So DARYLLSCOTT.com. So that's the easiest place to find me, and contact me through there or whatever else. So yeah, that'd be wonderful if people want to say hello. That'd be great. Always enjoy that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time today, Daryll.
No, it's been an absolute pleasure. It's real joy. Thank you. And what a brilliant podcast, Dave. So thank you very much for your questions, Julian. They were awesome.